Hi guys, it's Mark Zicree, Mr. Sci-Fi, also known as Mark Zicree of Space Command. And there's a lot going on, lots to talk about. Be sure to subscribe to Mr. Sci-Fi if you haven't. Click the bell, make a comment, throw us some money. You can buy Space Command shares and Showrunners Network shares down there. You can contact me at markzicree@gmail.com to find out all about that. We're having a big holiday party at our studio that you can be part of. But that's not what I'm here to talk about, nor the movie we're shooting, nor the series we're shooting, nor the pilots we're doing. All that stuff is for another day. Additionally, by the way, this Christmas is Rod Serling's 100th birthday, so I've been doing a ton of radio and TV interviews with Anne Serling, Rod's daughter, and talking about Rod and the Zone and all of those things. So if you look at Forbes or peoplemagazine.com or Fox News, I think I'm being interviewed by tomorrow. All sorts of stuff. Just keep an eye out and you'll hear me opine on a very worthy subject. But that's not what I'm going to talk about right now. Soon I'll be doing more of my history of science fiction film, and then I'll do history of science fiction radio and TV, and then I'll do history of science fiction comics. Lots to look forward to in the near future. But right now what I'm going to do is, a little while ago I did part one of my UK book haul, because I went to London with Elaine, and then we went to Hay-on-Wye, which is a bookstore town in Wales, and so I got some wonderful books, and I wanted to share them with you and talk about them and why they're cool and all that stuff. So we probably won't get through it all today, but we can take a crack at it and go from there. So here's, I'm just reaching down into the big box. So this is Quatermass 2, written by this guy, Nigel Neal, and this is the Penguin paperback. Now, those of you who don't know, Quatermass was a series of stories that were done on BBC, and then they were made into feature films, and they include the Creeping Unknown and Enemy from Space and Quatermass in the Pit, which is also known as 5 Million Years to Earth. Wonderful stories, and I highly recommend them. Both the video versions, what still exists of them, you can find those on YouTube and other places, and also the films. They have their weaknesses and strengths, but they're wonderful science fiction stories. Nigel Neal was one of the great British science fiction writers, and he chose film and TV as his medium. And you can see this cool cover with people getting sucked up into that sphere. Very cool. And back then, of course, when you watched a TV show, first of all, it was broadcast live, but secondly, if you loved it, there was no way to record it or watch it again unless they broadcast it again, and they tended not to. So what they would do sometimes is make a record of it where you could read the script and follow along, and sometimes they'd have some photos in the middle, like these, of the show, and you could revisit this wonderful story. So there are, like, I think 4 Quatermass paperbacks that you can find still on eBay, etc. And they're worth your time, but it's also great to watch the shows. My favorite, I think, of all the Quatermass stories, Quatermass, by the way, refers to this professor, this irascible British professor, who, well, in a couple of movies he was played by, an American actor, but he's quintessentially British. But my favorite was Quatermass in the Pit, which again was made into a movie with that title, but also in America known as 5 Million Years to Earth. It's a great story. It's really fun, and I highly recommend it. And I won't say any more about the plot, because then you can discover it yourself. So let's see what's also in the book crate. So this is a book by Philip Jose Farmer. He was probably best known for the River World series of books. He wrote a lot of science fiction adventure stories, and this is called The Day of Time Stop, and the original title was A Woman a Day, which I'm sure I have somewhere in the stacks here, but you can see it's a Kelly Freas cover with a guy holding a knife and a girl, naked girl, yikes, on a slab. This is an American paperback. There's a publisher called Lancer Books. They're hard to find, actually, because they were a smaller publishing house, but this book came out in, let's see when it came out. It was in, this was published in 1968, and it's a fun little book. Philip Jose Farmer is a fun writer to read. If you've ever seen a novel by Kilgore Trout, the imaginary science fiction writer created by Philip K. Dick, that book, Venus on the Half Shell, was actually ghostwritten by Philip Jose Farmer, or should I say pseudonymously written. A lot of people think that Vonnegut wrote it. It was not Vonnegut. It was Philip Jose Farmer, because although Kilgore Trout was inspired by my dear friend Theodore Sturgeon, one of the great science fiction writers, many science fiction writers identified with this character who, despite his best efforts and his imagination, ends up writing for terrible wages, and his stories are being published in porn magazines and all sorts of things. Many science fiction writers of that era identified with that character, and Philip Jose Farmer did too, until he did the Riverworld stories, the Riverworld novels. I don't think he really made much money as a writer, but he soldiered on. And so here's this cool book. Let's see what else we have in here. It's a cornucopia. Okay, so this is Taxi. This is the story of a British taxi driver back in the day. This is a signed copy, and it is really neat. It's here's the signature, and it is written by Maurice Levinson, and it's to Tony Coombs, a very charming and something friendly passenger of mine. Signed Maurice Levinson, July 1963. And the reason I got this book, and it's really kind of cool, okay, and is because it's about the life of a London taxi driver, which is very different from what it would be now. Back in 1963, and this is the author himself, you can see, and it says at the end, his present occupation and his pet hatred is driving a taxi. His ambition is to stop driving a taxi. Very funny, very witty. And but back then, they didn't have GPS. You had to memorize all the streets in London. It was very challenging and difficult to become a taxi driver, and the taxi drivers had to be very inventive, very clever, and they had great personalities, very full of stories and an attitude. And I just thought this would be a wonderful journey back in time. Let me see what also is in here. Well, I mentioned the other day On the Beach, which is one of the greatest after the bomb stories written by anybody, and it was written by Neville Shute in 1957. It was his last novel, and this is another book by Neville Shute, a British edition, of course, and it's Marazan. And this, interestingly enough, is actually his first novel. This is a reprint from the 50s, I believe, but published by Heinemann. Yeah, this is an edition from 1960, but Neville Shute's, this is his first novel. It was published in 1926, and he wrote it in the evenings while he was working at Crayford in Kent on the preliminary designs of the airship R-100, in which he subsequently flew on its first voyage. So he's a man of great adventures and great skills, and I look forward to reading his first book, when I've read many times On the Beach, which was his last book, and I highly recommend that book if you've never read it. Now, what do we have here? Aha! So this, sometimes I find books and they don't have the dust jackets, but I'll get them anyway because of what's in them. And this is just a few pounds. Sometime Never. And this is interesting because it has 3 novellas, one by William Golding, author of Lord of the Flies, a great book, dark book. John Wyndham, who of course wrote Day of the Triffids and The Midwich Cuckoos and so forth, and Mervyn Peake, who was a fantasy writer and an illustrator of great renown. And I picked this up just because the stories were intriguing to me. I've never read anything by Golding other than Lord of the Flies, and Wyndham is one of my favorite writers, so I thought it would be great to check that out. Let's see, and then this, what's in here? I went to an antiquarian book show in London, and in order to leave, they seal the package and make sure that you have bought the books that you're walking out with. So here it says Antiquarian Booksellers Association. Very cool. And inside is this little teeny tiny book. And it says George Meredith, 1909 by J.M. Barrie. Now, let me get this positioned right. There we go. And I'll hold it up long enough because people say, I don't hold these things up long enough. It's this curious little book. George Meredith was a famous writer of his era, British writer, and this is J.M. Barrie's remembrance of him. And there's many cool things about this. First of all, it is signed by J.M. Barrie, who many of you will know as the author of Peter Pan, and it's signed to a woman that he had a crush on, actually, Christmas 1909, and and it's just this little short, curious volume where it's about George Meredith, and it's this little short book that where he remembers his friend, and it's very touching, and you probably won't come across this very often, particularly not a signed copy, and so we grabbed it. Let's see what also we have down here. Now, I'm also interested in sort of the history of literature and its odd peccadillos. It's interesting. There's many books are being banned nowadays, and I, of course, strongly condemn that. And there's this big kerfuffle about Huckleberry Finn and whether the N-word should be used in Huckleberry Finn. I think, of course, that it should, because that was what people were saying then. That's the word that people were using. It captures the era, and if you sanitize it, it's less accurate to its time. Now, that doesn't mean that I approve of hateful things, but I just want to meet the past with its true face, So this was interesting. So there's a mystery bookshop in Hay-on-Wye, and it said this book is deliberately covered, okay? Is covered deliberately. And Stevens, and this is a book that was known, it was one of Agatha Christie's most successful books. It was called And Then There Were None. And it was made into a very good movie that you can catch, I'm sure, on YouTube. But that was not the original title. And this is a copy that has the original title, which I will show you. And again, the casual racism of its time. And I won't speak the title out loud, but you can see what it says. And, the fact that you could give a book this title and have this not be immediately censored, and that's very different from being censored, by the way, is interesting. And historically, it's very, very interesting that she would have a book that was titled this. And of course, in later years, she had to retitle it, and obviously in the movies they retitled it. But there you go, another little piece of history. This is a really cool book. There's a chapter in Dracula that was left out by Bram Stoker for brevity's sake. And after his death, his widow published Dracula's Guest. And this is from 1920. And it is really interesting because it has an introduction by Florence A.L. Bram Stoker. A few months before the lamented death of my husband, I might say even as the shadow of death was over him, he planned 3 series of short stories for publication, and the present volume is one of them. To his original list of stories in this book, I have added an hitherto unpublished episode from Dracula. It was originally excised owing to the length of the book, and may prove of interest to the many readers of what is considered my husband's most remarkable work. Really, really fascinating. But one of the most interesting things about this book, Dracula's Guest, is that Florence Stoker, after Bram Stoker's death, she was the keeper of the flame. She was the one making sure that his legacy would be remembered and maintained. And one of the things she did that was one of the more dark moments of literary history is that when Nosferatu was made, the great film by F.W. Murnau, the great silent film, she sued because it was infringing on Dracula's copyright, and it is Dracula, definitely, but they hadn't secured the rights, and so she sued them. And there was a judgment in her favor demanding, ordering that all copies of Nosferatu be destroyed. And most of them were. And for many years, Nosferatu was a lost film. Unfortunately, collectors had saved some bootleg copies, and that's why we have that wonderful film now. But that's a really remarkable little historical footnote. But this is it's really interesting to have this cool book, Dracula's Guest. Let's see what else we have here. Also, many of these books come with really strange bookmarks, which I save and utilize. What else do we have in here? Lots more to come. The World Below by S. Fowler Wright. He was a fantasy science fiction writer of the early part of the 20th century. This book's from 1929, and it's interesting because originally books did not have dust wrappers, dust jackets. And when they first started having dust jackets, they would just be literally to protect the book in the bookstore from getting dusty, so when you bought it, it was fresh and unsullied. And most people would, initially book covers, dust jackets, would not even have an illustration. They might have text describing the book or whatever, and then slowly but surely they became brighter and more vividly illustrated and so forth. But most people for many decades would just throw away the dust jacket once they got the book home. But sometimes what they would do, in addition, is they would cut the dust jacket out and put it inside the book. So this is the dust jacket for this book, The World Below, and it's inside the book, which I think is very charming. The World Below, first edition, second impression, Books for Today, London, 1929, spine slightly sunned with ends slightly rubbed, lacks front-free end paper. So cool, very cool. And so I'll be reading this little curious fantasy book, and there you have it. I'll probably put the dust jacket back on the front of it, where it belongs. So I mentioned Lancer Books a moment ago, and the fact that they have really interesting covers and sort of lesser-known works by different science fiction writers. This is another Lancer paperback, Recalled to Life by Robert Silverberg. And again, I think that's a Kelly Freas cover. If I'm not mistaken, it bears a lot of his hallmarks. You can see it's pretty cool. Guy on a futuristic operating table with, looks like robotic arms performing surgery. Pretty fun. Very, very fun. Silverberg was, for those of you who don't know, he was a friend of Harlan Ellison's, very prolific writer. I've met him a number of times. He's a really, really nice guy. Oh, look at this. By the way, for those of you who don't know, what's inside of this are pieces of Mars. It's a little reliquary with pieces of Mars, the surface of Mars in it. So there you go. Another Mr. Sci-Fi cool thing. So let's continue on. But Robert Silverberg, if you haven't read him, you should look up some of his greater titles and check him out. He's a very, very good writer. Now, this is the last books of H.G. Wells. Now, of course, H.G. Wells was the very famous writer of Time Machine, First Man in the Moon, Island of Dr. Moreau, War of the Worlds. He basically established many of the subgenres of science fiction in the late 19th century and early 20th century, and then became a big social critic, historian, on and on. Did many, many great things in his career. And then at the end of his life, these are sort of two of the last of his works when he was an old man and at the end of his days. Shortly after he died, I think in 1945, something like that, at the end of World War II, and so I started reading this. It has an introduction by his son, and it's published by the H.G. Wells Society, and I just am fascinated by that kind of stuff. Let's see what else we have here. This is another thing that's very cool. There, David Garrick was one of the great actors of the 19th century, the early 19th century, and so this is a playbill. London Stage, The Country Girl. It's price only 3D, London. It's a comedy in 5 acts that Garrick wrote, and this is a playbill, a souvenir of it. And what they have inside, it's very, very, very delicate. But what they have inside, I'll show you, is a little illustration. Let me show you this. It's really cool. There we go. And the pages are coming loose. But what's neat about this is it's an illustration from the play, but it's hand-colored. And so every copy of this, there was someone who would have to hand-color these illustrations. And then it's the play. It's the whole play in here in teeny, tiny, tiny, tiny type. So this is, theater was very, very popular in England in the 19th century. And David Garrick is one of the great actors, renowned actor of his day. And, of course, we will never see a performance because prior to film you couldn't see the great actors. You could just know of them through their reputations, and so there you go. But that's really a neat little souvenir. Let's see what also is here. I got this cool dinosaur postcard, very neat, very whimsical, and this little cute hedgehog card. So someone will get those once I figure out who to send them to. Now here, continuing with the book haul, this is an issue of Fantastic Stories, and it has a wonderful cover by Ed Emshwiller, who's one of my favorite science fiction artists, but it also has a short story by J.G. Ballard, one of the great science fiction writers, British science fiction writers of the 60s and beyond. He actually wrote a memoir about, or not, a fictionalized memoir of his childhood when he and his family were interned at in a camp in China by the Japanese, and it's a book called Empire of the Sun that was made into a movie directed by Steven Spielberg and starring Christian Bale as the young version of J.G. Ballard. But this has one of Ballard's early science fiction stories in it, and it's signed by Ballard inside. So I love collecting signed editions of books and magazines because, for me, it's interesting. Some people don't care about first editions. They don't care about illustrators or signatures. I love all that stuff. I even love when an owner has written his name in a book or he has his book plate in there, because it personalizes it. It makes that copy very alive. The past reaching out to me, and the fact that the J.J. Ballard not only had a story in here, but held this copy and signed this copy is really cool. And let's see what else we have down here. Okay. And we'll probably have to do part 3 of this wonderful thing. So this is a metal bookmark that I got at a bookstore in London. And what it lists, I can't really show it to you. It lists books worth reading. The Old Man and the Sea, The Chronicles of Narnia, Passage to India, on and on and on. I don't know if you can see. Let me do this. Maybe you can see. Maybe it'll focus enough to see that. But just lists a whole bunch of books that are well worth reading. Lord of the Rings, Alice in Wonderland, Great Gatsby, Handmaid's Tale. Just fun. And then this is an ad for we went to the Natural History Museum, and it says, take something home with you from the Natural History Museum shop. And it's got a kid taking a dinosaur home. And so I found that very charming. I love British humor. I think it's really, really charming and delightful. So this is a book by H.G. Wells. Before there were airplanes, he wrote a book around the turn of the century, the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, called The War in the Air. And this is his book about aerial warfare before there were airplanes. And he posits what that would be like. So this is a later paperback after World War I and World War II was imminent, and he's writing about how prophetic his book was. And I thought that was very, very interesting in the introduction. And then this is a copy of The Sirens of Titan, British edition. And it's a really weird cover. Kurt Vonnegut book. And Kurt Vonnegut, of course, is one of the great writers of science fiction and mainstream fiction. Slaughterhouse-Five, Sirens of Titan, Cat's Cradle, etc. And I just found this an intriguing copy, and it's fun to see what the Brits had to say about it. There's a quote from Brian Aldiss, the great British science fiction writer, in reference to the Sirens of Titan. He says, a classic, ripe with wit and eloquence and a cascade of inventiveness, Alpha Plus. And this is an edition from the 60s. So, now also, here's another thing. I mentioned that I read a lot of history, and I like reading histories written at the time of the event, first-hand accounts, all of that. And one thing that occurred to me recently, I read a lot about World War II and, alternative histories where the Nazis won and so forth, because, again, as a Jewish person, I wouldn't be here if Hitler had won the war. My mother would not have been here, my grandfather, all of my family, all the ones who stayed back in Poland were exterminated, and my grandfather fortunately came here before the war, and thus I'm here to be Mr. Sci-Fi and tell you these things. But it occurred to me, Hitler wrote the book Mein Kampf after the beer hall putsch, an unsuccessful attempt to overthrow the government. Hitler was in jail for a short while and wrote his manifesto, Mein Kampf. And it occurred to me that all of the copies I'd seen, even translated into English, were, they hadn't translated the title. And I thought, that's unusual, because usually a foreign book, they translate the title. And so I wondered if they had ever had, before World War II, before people knew what Hitler was, if they had published his book in English with the title translated in English. And I found this British copy from the 30s in dust jacket. And I thought it'd be very interesting to read this book, as hateful as Hitler is, to read this book from the standpoint of the publishers, the people writing the translator's preface and so forth, not knowing what a nightmare he would bring on the world. I mean, there's certainly warnings of it in here, and on my Mr. Politics page, I talk about authoritarian tyrants and so forth. But again, as someone who likes to read histories and likes to delve into the past and see, the the authentic words of those who lived that in that time, this is a book of great interest to me. And let's see, what also do we have here? Here is West of the Sun. This is Edgar Pangborn is another science fiction writer who's not very well known today, but he was a really, really good writer. And this has the dust jacket. This is the British edition. And he was, I believe, an American writer. And but I've read some of his other books. There's a book he wrote called Davy that's an after the bomb story that's very evocative. And, this is, I just love these kind of covers with the spaceship and, terrain and aliens and whatever, people reacting to this. It looks like the Abominable Snowman or something there. But, and I love these Brodart covers, these clear plastic covers you can put on books. They make even fairly beaten up dust jackets look pretty great. And, but Pangborn was writing in the, 50s, 60s, 70s, and he's good. He's a very good writer. And, and then you look through these books and you find, miraculous things. And sometimes at the end they'll have, little ads for other books. It says, "To the reader, if you would like to be advised of our new books as and when published, please send us a card giving your name and address, and this will ensure that you receive these particulars regularly. Robert Hale Limited, 63 Old Brompton Road, London, SW7. I mean, it's just swell. And then here's another book they're advertising, Planet of the Dreamers by John D. MacDonald. John D. MacDonald is very well known as a mystery writer. He wrote the Travis McGee novels, which are quite wonderful, and I highly recommend those. But he also took a stab at science fiction in the early days. And in fact, Planet of the Dreamers, here's the British paperback edition by John D. MacDonald. And, very fun cover, got astronauts, spaceship, and it's imaginative, exciting piece of science fiction, streets ahead of the normal, says the British Weekly. And this is the first paperback edition, and published by Viking Press, 36 Great Russell Street, London, WC1. And just, again, very, very fun. And, it's just, it takes you back, and a wonderful mixture of the future and the past. Here's another cool book. This is the 50th anniversary edition of Slaughterhouse-Five, the great book by Kurt Vonnegut. Some might say that it is his best book. There's a case to be made for that. And Vonnegut was a soldier, an American soldier being held by the Germans in the city of Dresden when it was firebombed by the Allies, and over 100,000 people died, and he was there to bury the bodies, among other things. It was a formative experience, and he wanted to write about it, and he struggled for many years to find the way in on the story. And he finally decided to put it within a science fiction context where the main character is a time traveler, jumping between different points of his life and ending up on a alien planet, being held in an alien zoo with an actress named Montana Wildhack. The movie version is very, very good too, but the book is just superlative, and if you've never read it, I recommend it. And I'd never seen this 50th anniversary edition before. It's British, and it has a lot of supporting materials, different information about how, Vonnegut's opinions about the book, how Vonnegut struggled with different drafts. It's got a really great series of appendices in the back, and, I really like this, and it wasn't expensive, so I grabbed it. And, it's, and this is published by Vintage. And let's see if they are an American or a British. Yeah, they're a British publisher. And, and so there you have it. But if you've never read Slaughterhouse-Five, I urge you to do so. It is one of the great works of literature. And then here, this is, there's a book, there's an author named William Gibson. His best-known book is Neuromancer. I've met him. We were on a panel together, and he asked me how he could break into Hollywood, which was great. And his version of Alien 3 is available as audio and also as a comic book. It's very different from the one that was made and much, much superior to it. I think on Mr. Sci-Fi I put the animatic, the combination of the audio and the video together. If you search for William Gibson's Alien 3 and Mr. Sci-Fi, you might find it. I highly recommend it. And this is a book of different pieces, and it says distrust that particular flavor. William Gibson, I think it's essays and so forth. But again, it's a cool book. And it's, this is Gibson. He's the one sitting up on the sofa. And this book is signed, which is, again, if you've been listening, you know that I like signed books, and this is a very cool one. And to Laura, William Gibson, and but he's a very, very good writer and a very interesting writer and a very interesting guy. And I saw him a couple of years ago at the Nebulas and gave him a copy of The Twilight Zone Companion, and we had a lovely talk, catching up. And he's he basically invented cyberpunk in one way or another, and deserves to be read. So let's see. And I think he invented the term cyberspace, by the way. Okay, another one of my favorite writers, Philip K. Dick, and this is a British SF Masterworks edition of a novel he wrote called Time Out of Joint, and it was originally published in, 1959, and this is a later edition, but it's very interesting because it goes into, his life. And there's an afterword by a writer named Lou Stathis, and it talks about Philip K. Dick's challenges as a writer. He wanted to be a mainstream writer and failed. He couldn't sell any of those novels, but he was very successful in science fiction somewhat, and it was only really at the end of his life that everything was kind of taking off for him. He saw some early footage of Blade Runner, but sadly did not live long enough to see the finished film, which was an adaptation of his great novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And then it's talking about different publishers he worked with and how he was ill-used and his struggles, and really, really a fun edition, and a great writer, wonderful writer. Here's another book by Philip K. Dick, Dr. Blood Money. I particularly like this cover. Again, SF Masterworks. This is a fun book, and again, it has a wonderful introduction that goes into how this book came to exist. It's an after the bomb story, but very, very specific to Philip K. Dick's tastes and way of attacking things. Has a wonderful introduction by Pat Cadigan, who is a female science fiction writer of my acquaintance, very nice woman, and boisterous and fun, and kind of a cyberpunk kind of writer, and but she knew Philip K. Dick, and so she goes into all the background on it. And Dr. Blood Money is called that because Dr. Strangelove was coming out at the time, and so because this is an after bomb story, the editor suggested the title Dr. Blood Money to kind of link it in to Strangelove, to give it maybe a little bit of a boost in terms of sales. But it's a very, very good novel and a very interesting one, and again, I recommend it. Let's see what else we have here. Aha! This is Danger in Deep Space. Now, this is interesting because this is a British edition, and it is by Carrie Rockwell. Willy Ley, the great German rocket scientist, is technical advisor on it. But what's fun about this is these were the novels, Tom Corbett, Space Cadet. These were the novels that were novels based on the Tom Corbett Space Cadet show. Well, that Tom Corbett Space Cadet was a live science fiction show that ran from 1950 to 55 here in the States. So no one in England would have seen this TV show, and yet they were selling the novels in the 50s that were from that show. So it's kind of interesting that you would find a copy in London of this book, and on the back it advertises Space Adventure Books by Jack Coggins and Fletcher Pratt. Fletcher Pratt was a well-known American science fiction writer, but these are British editions. It's published by Publicity Products Limited, Ad Print House, Rathbone Place, London. And these are the books they're advertising on the back. Again, I have that one on the with the two astronauts. I've got that in my collection. I haven't seen the other one yet, but I thought this was fun, and the cover's colorful. And I actually have a spacesuit from Tom Corbett's Space Cadet that was also used on Space Patrol, another great science fiction show of the early 50s. Let's see, we're making a dent in this pile, guys, I'll tell you. But this is a very interesting book, The Salmon of Doubt, by Douglas Adams. Douglas Adams was the great creator of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which was a terrific radio show and series of novels, and they adapted it also as a TV show and a movie. And sadly, I met Douglas Adams. He was on an interview show. We were both together on an interview show called Hour 25 many decades ago, and I thought he was a great guy, brilliant writer, brilliant imaginative writer who could really look at things from a different angle and write very funny and pithy work, and I'm a big fan of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy books. And sadly, he died of a heart attack at the gym, and so this book puts together some of his speeches, some of his little bits and pieces of writing. And at the time he died, he was working on a new novel called The Salmon of Doubt, which is wonderful but unfinished. And so it includes, so this copy includes the Salmon of Doubt as part of it. And it's a sad book because of his passing, but very funny also because he was such a wonderful humorist. And so I can definitely recommend this. And there you go. And let's see, how are we doing here? Okay. What else do we have? What else do we have that's interesting? Okay. This is another signed book, Security by Ariel Dorfman. Now, Ariel Dorfman is a Chilean writer, and this is a story about a man being stopped at the airport by security when he's just trying to get to his girlfriend who's leaving, and he's trying to patch things up with her. Girlfriend or wife, might be wife. And it's a little short book, and it's signed, and it's a special edition. But the funny thing about Ariel Dorfman is that he was one of my teachers at UCLA, and he was sort of an oddball. He was living in exile because the Chilean junta with Pinochet, by the way, it's Pinochet, not Pinochet. This is not French. Pinochet, now I've done it. Pinochet was the dictator, and he was torturing people in really terrible regime. And Ariel Dorfman was a writer who was finding safety here in the States. And one of the things he was espousing was the idea that the Disney comic books, Scrooge McDuck, etc., were being exported to Latin America as capitalist propaganda. Well, I thought that was a little bit wacky as a theory, but I can understand where he would be coming from with that. But it was really a wonderful blast of nostalgia to find this book and have him have his signature in it. Let's see, what else do we have in here? Okay, let me look. Okay. I went to the War of the Worlds experience in London, and actually had a photo of myself being blasted by a Martian war machine, and it was quite a fun experience. And this is based on the rock opera, which I'm not that big a fan of, but I'm a great fan of the original book. And then I also saw Hadestown, which one of my friends is a producer of that play, and it's quite wonderful if you've never seen it. And I can recommend it wholeheartedly. And also, Elaine and I went to the Museum of Natural History and got this photo of us. Let's see if I can hold it up where you don't get the reflection. Yeah, so we're being menaced by a Tyrannosaurus. So, who says life isn't good? And what else do we have here? Let's see. Another one of my favorite writers is Bill Bryson, who is an American writer who moved to England. And again, this is a signed copy. It's a Toby Happy Hanukkah, Bill Bryson. And I love signed books. And Bill Bryson is a humorist. He wrote a book about Australia, traveling in Australia, that's very funny and very informative. And I really love that. And I haven't read this book, Notes from a Big Country. This is where he goes back to America and writes about it. But he's a delightful writer. And this is what he looks like. So you can see, very friendly-looking guy. He's older than that now, of course. But again, it was only a few bucks or a few pounds, and Bob's your uncle. So now also, the one who founded Hay-on-Wye as a book town, he basically announced that they were seceding from the UK and establishing their own kingdom in Hay-on-Wye. And he was the first one to establish a bookstore there, and then invited other bookstores to join him. It was a guy, and he proclaimed himself the king of Hay-on-Wye, was Richard Booth, and he has a bookstore there called, Richard Booth Books. And so there was a printmaker who makes these wonderful prints, and this is an original, and we had a lovely chat, he and I, in his print shop, and I brought this home as a memento. Let's see, what also do we have in here? Let's see. Okay. Now over here, another writer that I'm a big fan of is a guy named H. Rider Haggard. Now, Haggard, he was a British guy living in South Africa in the 19th century, and he read Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson, which is a great book if you've never read it. And he said to his brother, I can write a book as good as this. So his brother said, well, prove it. So he wrote a book called King Solomon's Mines, which was this adventure story about a group of British guys who go into the jungle and discover the treasure trove of King Solomon while saving one of our hero's brothers who's gone missing. And it's a great adventure story. It's wonderful. I can recommend it. And then he wrote another novel that was, in my opinion, his greatest novel, which was called She. And it's about an immortal woman who rules a tribe in Africa. And it's, if you've never read it, go out, find it, read it. It's one of the greatest female characters in all of literature, and just a spectacular fantasy story. They've tried to make movies of it many times and really haven't succeeded at that, because she's supposed to be the most beautiful woman in the world, and that's something you can pull off in a book, and you can pull it off in radio, of course, but not in film or TV, because it's going to be a beautiful woman, but not the most beautiful. So, but then I found this book by H. Rider Haggard, again, not expensive. None of these books are terribly expensive. And this is called Finished by H. Rider Haggard. Again, someone clipped out the cover illustration and put it on the inside. And it's one of his last books. It says, the main figure in this book is that world-famous character Alan Quatermass. And again, it's not Quatermain, it's Quatermass. And this is one of the great characters. He's in King Solomon's Mines. He's a great character, a big game hunter. It says, the main figure in this book is that world-famous character Alan Quatermass, and everyone who loves a good book, even apart from the late Sir H. Rider Haggard's inimitable creation, will be enthralled by Finished, a story of adventure in South Africa and of Zulu witchcraft. The feud between Kali, the weird wizard, and Seteweo, the Zulu king, gives full opportunity for those thrilling incidents and deeds of personal heroism, in the relating of which this author so excelled, to the delight of what must be by now literally millions of readers. So this is one of his last books, if not the last book, and it was made in England, it says, printed in Great Britain. But what sets H. Rider Haggard apart, is that he lived in Africa, and he had great sympathy for the African people, the different tribes, and writes with a fidelity to that vision that is not the standard racism that you get in many British and American novels of the time. So I very much like his writing, and he was a huge devotee of ancient Egypt, was fascinated by archaeology, and the dedication of this book also struck me, because it says, here's the dedication: Ditchingham House, Norfolk, May 1917. This book is dedicated to Colonel Theodore Roosevelt, Sagamore Hill, USA. My dear Roosevelt, you are, I know, a lover of old Alan Quatermass, one who understands and appreciates the views of life and the aspirations that underlie and inform his manifold adventures. Therefore, since such is your kind wish, in memory of certain hours wherein both of us found true refreshment and companionship amidst the terrible anxieties of the world's journey along that blood-stained road by which alone, so it is decreed, the pure peak of freedom must be scaled, I dedicate to you this tale telling of the events and experiences of my youth. Your sincere friend, H. Rider Haggard. So this is May 1917, so World War I has begun, or has been going since 1914. It would end in 1918. And it's funny because he inscribes it to Colonel Theodore Roosevelt, but of course by then Roosevelt had been president of the United States. So it's a fascinating inscription, and really shows a side of these two men that I had not known before. So pretty cool. And I didn't know of this book. I knew of the writer, but not of that title. Let's see, what else can we show you guys? We're getting there. Okay, this is a play that I saw in England called Giant. It's about Roald Dahl, the creator of Willy Wonka and many other things. And it starred John Lithgow, the great John Lithgow. I own the space helmet that he wore in the movie 2010, and he was great. He was great in this play. The play is not as good as he is. It's about Roald Dahl's anti-Semitism, and it was a little polemical, but still interesting, and it was great to see him on stage. What else do we have here? Let's see. Well, okay, let me look. We have many, many, many cool things in here. Okay, so this is a little piece of what I call ephemera. Now, when you are in England and want to buy a pack of dry roasted peanuts, what conjures up dry roasted peanuts in your mind? Well, of course, a black woman in a spacesuit. I have no idea why this illustration is on this package of peanuts. I mean, I like the illustration. Anything with a spacesuit, I'm going to be a sucker for. But it's strangely whimsical and curious. So, but nice little illustration, but very weird. Mining rocks on the moon. I mean, they aren't even. I mean, I don't know if they're supposed to. No, they're not peanuts. They're rocks. Look, she has a little laser blaster, and she's doing something with those rocks on what looks to be the moon, and she's in a spacesuit. So I have no idea. I have no idea why they put that picture on the packet, other than to sucker me into buying these peanuts, which were tasty. Here's another great book, Novel on Yellow Paper by Stevie Smith, who is a female writer. Here, this is Stevie Smith, and she was a terrific writer, terrific poet, and there was a wonderful movie about her made called Stevie that starred the brilliant Glenda Jackson as Stevie Smith. And if you've never seen that film, hunt it down. It's terrific, and her poems are very, very moving. And she was a unique writer, and lived with her aunt for most of her life, and writes about that as well. And this is the Penguin paperback of that. Now, there were two science fiction writers in America called Frederick Pohl and C.M. Kornbluth, and they wrote individually, but they also wrote together. And this is one of their novels, Gladiator at Law, and this is the British paperback. And it might be a Richard Powers cover. I'm not sure. I'd have to check, but it's a very cool, striking cover. And this is science fiction at its most astounding. This is Digit Books, a British publisher, and this is a book from the 50s, and one of their great works. They were satirists, and had sort of this kind of interesting tilted view of things, and sort of like this is the background behind me. And I met Frederick Pohl a number of occasions. He lived to be an old guy, and whereas his partner C.M. Kornbluth died fairly young, I believe. I never met him. He was gone by the time I was around. But Frederick Pohl was one of the great writers and editors of science fiction, and he was sort of represented the East Coast contingent of science fiction, whereas a lot of the writers that I knew were the West Coast contingent, because that's where I grew up. But he wrote a memoir about the science fiction community of the 30s and 40s, and I haven't read it yet, but I intend to. And there you go. So here's another interesting book, The Far Reality. I'll pick that up later. The Far Reality, it has a cool cover, and it's by Lewis Paget. Now, this is a British paperback, but it's Lewis Paget is a pseudonym, which is the pseudonym of Henry Kuttner and C.L. Moore. They were a husband and wife writing team, and Lewis Paget was a pseudonym. The Lewis comes from Lewis Carroll. I don't remember where the Paget comes from, but this is a novel of theirs, and and it's interesting and curious. And this was written again in the 50s. I'm a sucker for 1950s science fiction. Here's another one of their science fiction books, Tomorrow and Tomorrow. Again, Lewis Paget. It's actually a writing team, and another very eye-catching cover. These are the British paperbacks, which I had never seen before. And but again, these paperbacks had to be very, very lurid covers, very eye-catching covers, because you'd be seeing them from across a store, maybe on a rack of paperbacks, and you'd decide what you were going to grab and pick up. And in many cases, you could judge a book by its cover. And here's a great British paperback of The Warlord of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs, very striking visually. And of course, Burroughs was one of the great early writers of science fiction and fantasy. He created Tarzan and John Carter of Mars, and Ray Bradbury was a huge fan of him. He read Burroughs as a child, and the first book that Ray ever wrote was when he was 12. He wrote a sequel to one of the John Carter of Mars novels because he couldn't wait for the next one to come out. He was impatient. And he would go outside and look up at the sky at night and say, "Take me home, Mars," and which John Carter would say. So this is not the first Mars book, but definitely one of them, and it's just, a pinnacle book, British edition, and I love that cover. And then here's another great book, Brigands of the Moon by Ray Cummings, another mid-level science fiction writer of the early decades of the 20th century, and that's an Ed Emshwiller cover. And this is published by Ace, but this was made its way to the British shore. And, Brigands of the Moon, a masterwork of interplanetary adventure. They never say on the books, well, this one isn't really very good, but, you know, if you've got nothing else to do. So here's Commander One by Peter George. He was the author, I believe, of Red Alert, which was made into Dr. Strangelove. And this is spine-chilling, engrossing, terrifying, says the New York Times, a major novel brilliantly portraying the execution and aftermath of worldwide nuclear war. We all lived under the threat of nuclear destruction in the 60s and beyond, and even till now. And so there were a lot of books written about that. And this, I'd never seen this book before. Obviously I've read Alert, but Peter George was one of these mainstream guys. And so I checked it out and thought it was cool and grabbed it. So let's see what else we have in here. This is Into the Slave Nebula, another Lancer book with another Kelly Freas cover. The author is John Brunner, who is a British writer who most famously wrote Stand on Zanzibar, which was a really great book about overpopulation that I have read. I have not read this, but clearly it's got this girl buying a blue slave, apparently. Something like that, so it's hot stuff. and certainly an eye-catching cover, and not offensive at all to anyone, right? And but you can tell what science fiction readers were looking for here. So, but I'll check that out. He wrote, John Brunner wrote a lot of sort of pulp fiction kind of stories, but then he hit the big time with Stand on Zanzibar, and then became much more of a serious writer. This happened with Silverberg as well, who really hit their stride in later years through the late 60s into the 70s. And I was actually at the convention where John Brunner died. I was giving a talk about Babylon 5 at the World Science Fiction Convention in Glasgow. And at the end of the talk, someone stepped up and said they had to announce that John Brunner, the guest of honor at the convention, had just died very suddenly and unexpectedly. So it was a very sad day. But again, his work is around, and you can pick it up and you can read it and you can see what he was doing with his time, and a writer worth checking out. Here's a book by Leonard Cottrell, and this is The Great Invasion. And this is a book about the Roman invasion of Britain. And just like I'm a huge have huge interest in World War II, I'm also fascinated by the Roman Empire. And if you want to know what's coming in America in the next few years, just go into the history of the Third Reich and the Roman Empire, and it'll tell you a lot. And then this is Skyport, and this book was very inexpensive, but something they probably didn't notice when they were pricing this book is that it is signed by the author, Kurt Siodmak. Now, he was yet another writer that I actually knew personally. Kurt Siodmak was a German writer, and he came to America fleeing the Nazis, of course, and he and his brother Robert, and they became writers and directors in Hollywood, and also became, Kurt Siodmak was a novelist, and he wrote, among many other things, Donovan's Brain, and he wrote the script for The Wolfman, so that whole little poem about when the wolfbane blooms in dark of night and anyone can become a werewolf, he wrote that. So that was, he was great. I met him at the Writers Guild retreat, and he was a very dear soul, and he was unlike many foreigners, he was actually able to write in an American patois, an American voice that you never would have guessed that it wasn't his first language. And so this is Skyport, about a space station. Well, Elaine's giving me the high sign, so I'm going to have to stop right now. So next time we'll talk about some of these other books, like Fallen Star by James Blish. But for now, it's Mr. Sci-Fi. Subscribe, like, do all that stuff if you want to buy shares in Space Command or the Showrunners Network and be part of our world and come on the set and put on a spacesuit and all the wonderful things we do. Just email me at markzicree@gmail.com, and I will be happy to send you the information. So thanks very much. I hope you've enjoyed this little tour down literary lane, and we will see you next time. Bye, guys.